Welcome to the Educational Physics Podcast. I am your host, João Figueiredo. This podcast is all about education, pedagogy, mindset, and really any other nonsense that I think about during the week. Enjoy. Today's podcast is a conversation with Kaylee Rose. Kaylee Rose is a therapist based in New Jersey, in the United States, and the focus of our conversation was almost exclusively on trauma and what trauma is, how it develops, and how it affects people in so many different ways. Obviously, because of my own biases, I pulled the conversation towards the impact of trauma on education. But of course, the meta needs of humans when it comes to learning in a general sense, learning how to cope, learning how to cooperate with each other, learning how to thrive and live a fulfilled life, all of that is impacted by trauma. Kaylee was a fantastic guest. I really enjoyed my time with her. Our conversation flowed incredibly smoothly, and I very much look forward to speaking to her again. I hope you enjoy. Awesome. So, first of all, thank you for doing this. I know that we don't really know each other. The only thing that, and that's absolutely fine. I'm gonna ask about your backstory, but I'll tell you why I sent you that message. So I started following you on Instagram, and for me personally, it's always very refreshing when I see people speaking a bit more honestly and openly about the way that the mind works and the way we work as humans, what is real about human nature. I'm very interested in understanding how you landed there in the first place, because we know that there's a bit of a trend for blind positivity nowadays, and we're losing touch with what pain is, where it comes from, how to deal with it. We kind of live in a culture of brushing it off and post your best picture on Instagram.
Right. Absolutely.
So yeah, so that's why I messaged you, because I saw that your content was so open and so honest, including about yourself, which I personally try to do the same. I've never been a big fan of just posting my highlights, but and I'll tell you in a second what my, I guess, broader topic for today's conversation is. But would you mind sharing your backstory, how the interest for psychology and how you became a therapist? So the floor is yours.
Yeah. Well, I started, I've always been sort of interested in like existential questions, and that's just sort of kind of my personality type, is to be very curious. I started out career-wise in music education. I went to a conservatory and sang, and it was just a very high pressure situation. The school is called Westminster, and we called it Stressminster.
Right.
And so I I just became fast. I happened to do yoga teacher training at the same time as being in this high pressure school situation. And so I became very fascinated with well-being and wellness, and the intersection of like well-being and spirituality and meaning, and how we make meaning of our lives as humans, as an artist and just as a person. And I became very sort of turned off by that, conservatory mentality. That it was sort of just like pull yourself up by your bootstraps and be the best, and perfectionism. And it didn't feel like it actually honored the art that we were all trying to create at the end of the day. And so I moved away from that, and I ended up getting really into the wellness world through yoga. And, I worked at a yoga clothing store and I sold stretchy pants to rich people and, drank the Kool-Aid there. And it was, very much like corporate wellness,
Mm.
personal responsibility and positivity and take accountability for yourself. But really, it's just a way to get your employees to work really hard for like $14 an hour. And and as I got deeper into that, I sort of went through a bit of an awakening, realizing how these spiritual ideas can be used to, manipulate people, that toxic positivity that you were talking about. And then I decided to go into mental health, evidence based mental health, and sort of like dive into more of the science and go get my master's degree and build sort of a platform for myself that would be a little more grounded. And so now I find myself in this space of, um, having a deep sense of spirituality myself, but having seen sort of like the shadow side of the wellness industry firsthand.
Mhm.
And I try, and it was so great and, lovely to hear your feedback about my Instagram, because I do try really hard to be really authentic and honor all parts of being human when I communicate about some of these ideas, um, because I think that's what's missing in that, wellness space. And so that's how I find myself where I'm at. I do still really value that integrative wellness model of, using all these different practices to heal, but hopefully in a more balanced way that honors, how complicated that actually is.
Yeah. Well, you already gave me a lot of threads to pull from because I didn't know that you had a background in music because I run a music school and
I
that's
saw
that
that.
right that's my backstory. I started as a musician, as a professional musician, touring, doing the whole thing, and then started teaching like anyone else starts teaching when they're a musician because you need some side money.
Money. Right.
Uh, there's more to that, but I did start teaching as a way to stay busy also during the day because I started teaching young. So to be honest, like my money wasn't really a pressure yet.
Mm.
Um, but that was like where I come from as well, and I saw my my pet peeve was with education in itself. So because I come from a family of educators, nothing to do with music. So that was the connecting tissue between all my relatives was that anyone and everyone rather taught something. Right? It was
Mm.
whatever their expertise was, they would teach it.
Ah.
And and I had such we generally as a family we had such general discomfort when it came to how the system worked. It was very, and we all know it's still a problem, if not worse, um, diluted, designed for the masses. We're trying to um, train more than educate, more than facilitate, which is training the next generation of laborers and the workforce. It's bad, and I started seeing that, including in music. So that was when in music education when I started to get exposed to more, I guess, grades and results oriented sort of institutions. And that for
Mm.
me, my big awakening was in 2012 when I was literally told as a teacher, as a music teacher working for a company, that it didn't really matter if they knew anything as long as I signed them up for exams.
Oh,
Because
geez.
because there's a financial right benefit to
Incentive,
the
right?
when it comes to, and that was very difficult to endure. That whole process was very traumatic, which is going to get us into the conversation of today. But and then over the years, I started to feel more and more curious, like you said earlier, about the way people learn. That was my entry point. How do we learn? And I started studying just general, the neuroscience of learning and absorbing information. And then I started reading more on philosophy. And you already brought up words that are a part of my daily vocabulary, such as meaning. For me, to create that experience of not just finding but assigning meaning to a certain feeling or emotion or process that we're going through, that could be, as you know, which I didn't know but learning a music piece can be so frustrating, and yet that frustration is the trigger to elevate the learning experience, which is very interesting. But the educational system doesn't promote that from what I mean is that it doesn't allow for that frustration, doesn't allow
Right.
space.
It's
You
too.
just
I was literally just about to say that word.
just
I
keep
resonate
going.
it.
Just keep
Right.
going. Just keep right. It's keep going. We got grades to get to, results, rankings, and I don't know what the reality is in the states, to be honest. But I know, and you can share that if you want. But here, the public and the private sector, in my opinion, is creating the next generation of people with no meaning, with no notion of meaning and purpose. Um,
Yeah. It's
Especially
all about the
this,
result.
yeah, and the structure here is it's different than what I experienced in Portugal, although in terms of curriculum, we have the same problems. It's very diluted, it's very standardized, with not a lot of space for creativity. But here it gets even worse. And I'm very open about this. This is not some sort of coming out of the closet. I despise the way the system works in the UK. And I have a child in the educational system here, so this is it's very close to my heart, and it's a major concern on a day-to-day basis, because the schools themselves are ranked, and that ranking is public. So what does that mean? Those kids are employees as far as these schools are concerned, and they must
Wow.
work for the ranking,
Oh my goodness.
right? So
Yeah.
they're working for the school rather than the school working for them.
That's got to bring up a lot of issues of self-worth and performance and
It's
perfectionism
yeah,
and
oh yeah, and
wow.
and the my biggest concern really is what kind of psychological impact we're causing, like you just said, on these children, from the standpoint of especially the how people learn. Everyone learns differently, and that's not allowed. We're running a program here, so you have to follow along. So I guess I'll all of that will lead into my first question. I already brought up that I have nowadays more and more concerns when it comes to trauma. And yes, I explore that topic a lot, including in this podcast, as to how that affects learning, negatively for the most part, positively when integrated correctly. Um, how would you define trauma?
Mm, big question. um, Simply put, I would define trauma as any experience that's too overwhelming, too much, too fast, overwhelms the nervous system, and sort of imprints itself in the body and mind because of the overwhelming nature of the experience in combination with, you know, no relief or a feeling of helplessness, like a trapped feeling for that person. And that can be mitigated by, resiliency and support and, all kinds of environmental factors, biological factors. But it's very individualized. If your nervous system is experiencing too much too fast, then whatever it is experiencing can be traumatic.
Yes. Yes. I think I would define trauma the same way. I think that it's also interesting for us to think here together on the impact of slow trauma, because
Mm,
often it's obvious we can see fast trauma.
right.
And I discussed that just for those who've been listening to the podcast. I talked about those two in the last episode, where I discussed, yeah, that society, broadly speaking, can understands easily what fast trauma is caused by. A car
Hmm.
crash, relative that dies suddenly and unexpectedly. Um, so I even shared a personal story of being a victim of robbery, and it was quite violent and it was quite brutal and it was very quick, right, as it goes with those situations, and it lasted a long time. But then we have the effects, that is, and then we have also the trauma caused by bad parenting, or
Mm,
a system, an environment that slowly but surely creates these narratives that we hold on to for a long time. How do you see that in today's society? How do you, especially, and I apologize if I pull that thread a lot, especially for children.
yeah, I like how you differentiated it by calling it fast and slow trauma. That's I haven't heard anyone use those terms, but it makes a lot of sense to me. Um, I sort of think of it as a cumulative trauma.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think that is really important and not understood or spoken about as much as like that very shocking fast trauma. And I think of it, yeah, as sort of like many small moments built up upon each other. So if you think about it, I think about it sort of like a cup that might be being filled like one drop at a time until it's overflowing with whatever that trauma is causing. And like you said, it can be anything from, you know, just emotional neglect as a child, not being seen, not being heard, not feeling understood, to living in an unsafe neighborhood and walking home from
Hmm.
school every day and not feeling safe. It could be, being affected by diet culture and body image issues over your all of your teenage years, and then developing an eating disorder because of that. There's so many different ways that society and culture sends us these little messages in like this like intrinsic learning, where we're just consuming messages from our family, our teachers, our communities, the media, and that seeps into our self-worth and how we see ourselves. And over time, that can absolutely become a trauma. Shapes how we can see ourselves in the world, and then that may result in not feeling safe in it.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, what, in your experience, what how do you see trauma manifesting itself, in adults, for all that matters? But because I work more with, I also work with adults, but more with children,
Mm,
um, and my career is taking me down this path of educational psychology. So I'm working within schools as well. Um, how do you see that manifesting itself, say, 20 years down the line in your
mm.
practice?
Uh, I mean, in so many ways, in how we relate to one another, the health of our relationships, our self-worth, how we view ourselves, our self-awareness. A lot of people who um, have a real lack of sense of self-worth are so afraid of the shame that they feel when they really self-reflect, that they will avoid it at all costs. And
Mhm.
so we have people walking through the world largely unconscious, not self reflecting, not able to put themselves in other people's shoes or look at things from other perspectives because it feels so threatening and unsafe. That, we have a bunch of adults just reacting to each other, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Sorry, go on.
oh, that's okay. I mean, I think that there's a lot of, there's sort of the idea that everything is trauma right now. Like I'm
Mm.
seeing a lot of conversations um that people are conceptualizing that all mental health issues are rooted in trauma, and we don't have a ton of research to back that up at this point. Trauma research is like relatively new, at least this type of slow trauma that we're talking about in within the field in general. But I think it's
Mhm.
a really interesting concept and idea that um, most of our struggles are can be related to not having our needs met at some point.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's both. I mean, it's pretty clear to me from the data that I've empirically and merely from the standpoint of watching um, now thousands of children reacting to the same problems, give or take, that I bring upon them, right? So we have challenges to overcome. And obviously, as you know, we start to identify certain patterns, and it starts to become um, pretty clear that people react a certain way to a certain problem due to how they conceptualize the whole world. So, giving you a very simple example, which will resonate with you as well, since you shared your um, how do I put it, your annoyance with the way the music academia,
Mm.
because you mentioned that at the beginning, the way it's can be so rigid and it's all about following the score, for example, which you mentioned.
Hmm.
Conservatories are infamous for just it's the score. It's all about the score. You don't
Right.
really get to have a voice as you perform this. But as I expose a student, for example, to a problem to solve, that being a passage of a song or an exercise, doesn't matter. One student can look at that problem as a challenge, and they are motivated by the idea of the outcome, and they can see it coming. Even some of them, quite interestingly, without even me personally showing them. Okay, this is what's going to go sound like once you practice lots. Sometimes I don't even have to do that. They envision that. They have a really good motivational compass. They can see
Mm.
like, okay, challenge means reward. It's well integrated in their system, and that would be a good example of someone who's clearly being raised to understand that it's all a game. As long as we understand the rules of this, the struggle is going to pay off. And then you have other students on the complete other side of the spectrum that is scary at times and overwhelming for myself, how the most minuscule, I mean, I would even say, yeah, I'm going to say it that way. The most minuscule amount of negative feedback, you witness a complete meltdown of all belief systems.
Right.
And it's so fast and so visual, so reactive. You say, something as harmless at face value as, uh, so we're rushing a bit there during that section. Let's try that from the beginning a little slower. And the reaction is, I'm done because I'm not accepting this.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
it doesn't even register in their system as what was said is what it was said, but what goes in, as you know, is a translation. and it translates to I'm not good enough.
Right.
And
Rejection.
yeah, and when you start to dig into what's causing this, what you find is it's interesting because then it kind of there's a bit of it splits into two different um, sources. So of course, one being, they have really punishing parents and they're really tough on them. So anything that smells of negative feedback just, turns off the alarms, and it's like, oh, I'm gonna get punished or criticized, mocked, whatever. But
Right.
funny enough, there's also another angle, which is children who are raised to believe that they can do no wrong. So actually, they
Mm,
lack resilience, which goes back to the beginning of this toxic positivity.
mm,
They can't do anything wrong. So when actually reality hits them in the face, like, yeah, you can, and that's okay. They can't understand it. You can see that it's hitting a blank spot. Do you have any strategies from the standpoint of therapy as to how you would help someone cope with that side of things, specifically of not having the ability to cope or to even process that a mistake is not a failure necessarily?
ooh, that's a tough one. Yeah, that's a really like interesting uh, dynamic comparing those two scenarios.
Yeah.
I'm um, thinking about scaffolding and how um, setting up that situation, like breaking it down into like very small steps, very intentionally could be helpful. So like the communication around like preparing that person before giving the feedback, and like, you know I think we have to
Mm-hmm.
sort of at that point, and this is just my first reaction, is to explicitly teach resilience through like intentionally giving that feedback in like sort of a framed, scaffolded way where the person is like prepared for it and warned that it's coming, or even asked to find it for themselves. Like, what could you have done better? What are you observing? Um, and then sort of reinforcing that the noticing itself is an accomplishment, and celebrating noticing a mistake, so that it becomes,
Yeah.
you're giving positive reinforcement to the process itself.
Yes, I mean, in a way, if we go get a bit more nerdy, it's associating dopamine to messing up.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, that kind of falls in line with the base idea of humanistic education, for example, right? Where you would do exactly that, right? So Carl Rogers was perhaps, I'm not sure. Don't take my word for this, but I think he was the one who, if not coined, definitely used a lot the word scaffolding. Right? He was a pioneer of that concept of creating that structure that really allows then the whole process of, in this case, learning, because Rogers was focused on the educational side of things, although he was a psychologist, um, giving everyone a very clear platform for learning, and then educators like myself in this case, just mere facilitators. I'm here if you need me, but this is your gig. and
Right.
uh, and that's very difficult for a lot of children. It's a very difficult process. They feel very it's not, which is interesting then to see how they evolve into the and accept the process as they get comfortable with themselves, taking charge and taking ownership over their own learning process. But at first, it's quite interesting to see how uncomfortable they feel.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about how they're trained to feel that discomfort
Yeah.
from our educational systems. Um, you know, don't write your name on the paper until I tell you to write your name on the paper. Don't skip ahead. Don't do it your own way because then you're going to be in trouble because you did it wrong. There it's so methodical that there's no space for figuring it out yourself. There's no time, there's no space, there's no that's not a part of their experience. And I'm even thinking about at home, when parents can be, and there's every type of parent out there, so this is just a generalization obviously, but I'm thinking about like authoritarian parenting and parents who will tell their child, how to build a snowman. You're doing it wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, like it's no surprise to me that, they land themselves in a creative learning environment, like with music, with a teacher who's taking that humanistic approach. And it's like, whoa, I don't know, this is too much gray area. I'm not used to this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly like it just feels so like there's so many options, which of course then the facilitator, in this case myself in this scenario, would then create some sort of, again, it's the scaffolding idea, right? Would create some sort of, okay, let's create one boundary over here, one boundary over there. You think we can bounce about now a little bit, and
Right.
just you know where the walls are, so when you hit them you'll feel them. It's all good. And I bring these all these concepts into the way I parent as well, um, as I believe, and I've believed this ever since my son was born, is that there's so much more to children than what people want to believe, and it's very interesting. And we can talk about the what happens to our inner child and why we dislike that character so much, as we grow up. It's so interesting how as we grow older we become conditioned to look at who, as in through other children or our children, how we start looking at who we once were as completely incapable human beings, and you guys don't know anything. Like, did you really think of yourself like that? I don't think so. I think you wanted independence back then, so what's going on here?
There's a huge disconnect.
Right, what do you think causes that conflict with our inner child?
You mean like the conflict of how we see children as adults?
Yes, but in my opinion, that's got to do with the way we see the child we still have inside of us, and we
Mm.
don't want that person around too much. It's
Ah,
we see it as weak and too vulnerable, and I this is my, it's a theory. I think so, now I'm going into the realm of philosophy. Really, this is no, there's no science here whatsoever.
I'm with you. Let's go.
um, I think a lot of this, not dislike, but disrespect for the ability that a child has to not only just figure things out, but to really carry a natural wisdom with them.
Hmm. Hmm.
That dismissal that most grown-ups have towards that sort of, um, I guess, less organized way of perceiving or seeing or experiencing emotions, for us, quote unquote us. I hope that I'm not a victim of that trap, but for most adults that is not only uncomfortable to see children, like, why does a child throw a tantrum? You're just being annoying to me.
Right.
I think you're just projecting, not you, right? But I think that person is just projecting how annoying it is, the amount of tantrums they throw inside.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about like, um, I'm thinking about our cultural stories around um, the inner child, the playfulness, the joyfulness, the vulnerability, the feelings that, like maybe, and I'm not like a historian, so, I'm kind of pulling this out of thin air, but I think like maybe around like the Enlightenment, there was this move towards like rationality and rational thinking, and that became like the big, like cool thing of the
Hmm.
time. And I think that shaped a lot of like philosophy and a lot of how we think in the West, at least, about like what we value. And we have this narrative that I think is total bullshit, that, rationality and rational thought and that inner adult part of us is more valuable than the emotional, wild,
Yeah.
vulnerable side. And I think it's just like a cultural norm. And so we miss how much wisdom there really is in that, that wild part of us, that intuitive part of us. We totally discount it because and this is just personal opinion, not like a psychological fact. I think it's because it's so vulnerable and visceral, and it's like the stuff of being human. It's like
Hmm.
that gray area, that uncertainty, that surrender, that no, you can't just know a fact. You can't just know scientifically, something. Not everything is black and white. And so playing in allowing that part of ourselves to drive the bus is pretty terrifying for most people, because I think we fundamentally lack trust in that process.
Yeah, I agree. I think most people lack trust. Period. There's so much pressure to grow up fast and well established. We have all these preconceived ideas of yeah, like you have to behave a certain way. You have
Acceptance. Hmm.
success and ambition. You must be ambitious, and but you must be a certain kind of ambitious. But let's be careful there. Um,
Right.
don't get
Humble, fake humble, but yeah.
yes, uh, and um, and it's so interesting for me to see, for instance, when that happens in the child's development, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not a random age where that switch, in this case, I would say, turns off
Mm-hmm.
when they go
Like a
from
gradual process.
yeah, it's when they enter the education system. As soon as that happens, that they just turn off that switch. That the one we were talking about of carrying a wisdom that they just simply trust. They just
Mm-hmm.
my
Their own
son,
experience.
the way they see it's the way it must be, and I'm gonna trust that. This is how I'm feeling about the situation, and it can be the most innocuous things like. We're walking on a muddy park, and there's a big, nice muddy puddle there, and he jumps right in it. He was so excited up until his socks got all wet, and he starts crying. All of that was real life for him.
Right.
This is happening, and I'm not gonna hide it. And
Mm-hmm.
then as we start to age, of course, there's something to be said about developing coping mechanisms and developing perspective as to how much emotion am I going to dispense with here. But in face of a situation such as, well, I did jump into the puddle, which was the conversation basically that we had, by the way. Well, you jumped into the puddle. And the answer
Cause and
was,
effect.
yeah, exactly. And the response was, yeah, I didn't think that could happen. Well, now you know.
So
And that's called
sweet.
learning.
Right, right. Well, and there you go. There's like that intrinsic learning and learning by your own experience rather than the sort of um like pre-prescribed type of learning that we think of, yeah, in academia. And
Yeah, and in parenting, and the parents, by the way, poor parents were conditioned by this system as well, right? That
Right.
they've been rewired. Because the same scenario could have happened completely differently. Yeah, I could have been like, look, there's a puddle there. Don't even get close to that puddle. You're going to get your socks wet. Don't go get your socks
Right.
wet. You're going to find out if you like it.
Experiential.
That's my style. If it's not going to hurt you, I'm going to let you do it.
I love it. Yeah. Yeah. I think there's just so many factors that we get programmed by, so many different influences all the time, and also so much of that influence can be resiliency, and like
Mhm.
I'm just thinking about like the value of you letting him jump in that puddle and have that experience and carrying him for him through his emotional experience and being upset about what had happened and helping him move through those emotions in a safe way rather than piling on blame and shame and yeah, look what you did, it's your fault that you're upset, like you just helped him feel it, reflect on it. That's the type of learning that's going to build so much resiliency for him as he grows. I love it.
Absolutely, and that's the idea. I mean, um, I believe I also spoke about this in that last episode because I introduced this is going to be a series of episodes on the subject of what things that block learning
Mm.
as you grow up, I guess. And one of the things that I brought up was also the difference between parenting styles that then I guess create different mindscapes on these children as to how they react to mistakes. And I talked about that student who just like, no, mistake is not a thing. Shut down. I'm done. But of course, there's also the more, I guess, more subtle, nuanced ways to damage self worth. For example, what you just said, right? That same situation, jumps in the puddle, gets all wet, gets upset because I didn't want this to happen, and then the parent comes in like and mocks the child. The amount of times I see this, it
Mhm.
blows my mind because these parents, and I appreciate that 90%, 95% probably are not doing that because they have some sort of like psychopathic problem
Right.
or miswiring in their systems themselves. It's because they've forgotten, again, they've lost touch with that inner child. They have forgotten how children perceive language and
Mm.
how they translate that. Because as we are still children, and Jean Piaget was also very focused on this, how we everything goes through a filter of how does this make me feel, rather than
Mhm.
more of a it is what it is sort of mindset, and very rigid. And we've talked about that today already, right? And children don't do that. They hear a word and that immediately becomes an emotion. Anything we
Right.
say becomes an emotion, it becomes latched onto that emotional map they have. So when I do this, I
Right.
feel that. When I do the other, I feel this. And then as they grow older, like from age 2 especially, they become more aware of when I do this, they feel this.
Mhm.
Which that's when it starts to get tricky. The role of the parents and the role of the caregivers starts to become very very important, very nuanced, and we have to be very cautious because children become aware of their I guess their world, which starts with the family, and they become much more attuned to that idea of when I'm, this is a word I don't use, for example, in parenting, but when I'm naughty, which is a very like traditional thing to say, which
Mhm.
I hate that word. When I'm naughty, my dad gets angry,
Mhm. Right.
which for the father could say, I'm not angry. I'm just telling him off. I'm just disciplining him. Yeah, but
Right.
maybe there's ways to go about that, because if you're shouting at the child doesn't think like, oh, what a great way to make me rethink my life. They just think
Let
my
me go
dad is
reflect
angry.
on
Yeah,
this.
yes, exactly. No, the child just thinks my dad is angry. And what
Oh,
I did
and
was
that
an accident. I didn't even want to do it.
and that makes me think about intergenerational trauma, and that if dad's nervous system is not regulated
Yeah.
and the kid jumps in the puddle, and then he starts thinking about all the laundry he's going to have to do now, and oh, we were supposed to go run this errand, and now we have to go home to change the socks, and the overwhelm, and now he's in fight or flight mode. Then he the kid's nervous system, he is in fight or flight mode already because his socks are wet. He needs a calm nervous system in order to calm down. But when he's met with another nervous system that's in fight or flight mode, now we're all just going to have a meltdown together,
Yeah.
and it's going to blow up and turn into something, traumatic for everybody. And so a lot of parenting has to do with, the mindful groundedness of parents.
Yeah. I mean, it's the word, it's attunement. It's finding
Right.
that balance, right? If you're vibrating at this very kind of high frequency sort of wavelength there, and the parent, the caregiver, that being the teacher, the parent, whoever, yeah, must step in and provide the balancing wavelength, the one that's going to
Right.
bring everything back down to the middle, and then we can navigate. Okay, if and there will be situations that, yes, you're going to have that serious conversation with a child where you're going to have to sit down, and what the child also doesn't know, and I have actually these conversations with my son where I open up my book. I tell him, like, I think it's fair for you to know what I'm feeling right now, which is I don't really want to have this conversation. I'm not taking
Right.
any pleasure from this, because it's sometimes like it's that idea that, my parents are after me. Oh my God, they can't. I'm very open. Oh, I don't want to have this conversation, so we need to find tools so we can avoid it at all costs.
Right. Being, leading by example and sharing your own experience is
And
really important.
he tells me, okay, so I could do this, I could do that. He tells me I don't have, and that's the wisdom that we forget they have. They know how
Right.
to do problem solving. All
Hmm.
they need to do, and I'm a big believer in this, is to be asked the right questions
Yes.
instead of constantly being told, think this, do that.
Right. We need a lot more curiosity, just as like a species, as a culture, as a society. Curiosity would change a lot,
Mhm.
I think.
I agree. Um, so I guess I want to ask you before we share our final thoughts. I guess if you had, and this is a very very metaphysical question, if you had
Okay.
full power over the world for a day,
Oh, geez.
magic wand question, and
Okay.
you could just do one thing that would, I guess, change the world for the better, what would that be?
Oh, I don't want that kind of power, but
Yes,
if I
I was
had to
afraid.
have it,
I was afraid I was going to be summoning the narcissist in you, but
right? uh, I think that what I might do is download mindfulness skills into the minds of all of humanity, because I think when we have the skills to sit with ourselves more fully, then we can relate to ourselves much more effectively, relate to others. And then, I think part of the power of humans is connection. And one of the things that I think that I see mostly get in the way of that is shame and uh, lack of self compassion. And I think mindful self awareness is a path towards those um, those attributes. So yeah, I would download those skills into everyone's brain with my magic wand.
I like that. I'm a big fan of mindfulness. Self-awareness is a process. That's another word that's become very,
Buzzworthy.
yeah, and sometimes it gets me, and I feel myself. I guess I become aware of myself feeling frustrated because it's become so diluted in the popular, I guess, dialogue, that it has lost a bit of its meaning, as it being a process of constantly
Right.
being able to hear yourself think, talk, react, understand, like what triggers a sequence of events that then leads to that. You just flip out over something, and then you have to sort of reverse engineer it. Like, where did that start? Because if I was
Right.
just chilling, having my coffee, and then 5 minutes later I'm having a fit and I'm shouting, and it came from somewhere, and that self-awareness and that mindfulness, or that ability to just practice stillness, I guess that would be my magic wand. I'm going to try to come up with a different one for every single episode, because if I ask that, I kind of feel compelled to also share what mine would be, but I can't always share the same one, because otherwise, what's the point? I would say today I'm going to go with stillness.
Love it. Yeah. Yeah. It's an experience. It's not a destination. And I think what you said, we have lost a bit of the meaning of it. And I think in order to really get back to its true value, people have to experience it rather than just talk about it.
Yes. Yes. It's going back. I think all the notes we've hit today brings us back to the classics. And you even mentioned enlightenment, which I'm not. I'm also not an historian, but I would say that we've lost a lot of what we had in the classics, in the philosophy classics. What? And I'm gonna. I guess this is the last question for you. What advice would you give to, in this case, educators, when it comes to recognize how to recognize and then deal with trauma?
Mm. Um, I guess uh, I guess what I would say is like unhelpful behavior patterns. Um, the things that we think of as acting out are really just children trying to get their needs met.
Mhm.
And so it can be helpful for us to notice our own judgments and our own reactions and our own frustrations in those moments, and bring a sense of open curiosity to what is this child needing in this moment. And they probably won't be able to tell you in words, and so they're telling you in behavior, and it's our
Mhm.
job to figure out what that message is. And also to acknowledge that your job is really, really hard, and that you also deserve support and care. And so are you getting that? Are you caring for yourself as well in the process of this like huge responsibility that you have?
Yeah. Mindfulness and self care. I think
Back to
those are the two.
basics.
Back to basics. Well, I really, really appreciate your time. Just before we go, I'd like to tell everyone where they can find you. So I've got Kaylee Rose Therapy on Instagram. That's also your website, KayleeRoseTherapy.com. Anywhere else you'd like people to go and find you?
That's mostly where I hang out these days. And I'm definitely addicted to Instagram through this pandemic, so you can find me there most days.
Yeah, okay, so I'll just say it again. Kaylee Rose Therapy on Instagram and KayleeRoseTherapy.com.
Thank you so
Any,
much.
my pleasure. Any last thoughts that you'd like to share with the world?
Uh, this is a hard time. Remember that we're all surviving a crisis. So slow and steady, lots of gentleness.
Slow and steady. I
Yeah.
second that.
Thank
Still,
you for the
even if you
lovely,
can, still.
yes, stillness. Thank you for the lovely conversation. It was so great.
My
Appreciate it.
pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Have a good afternoon.
You too. Bye bye.